Well, good afternoon, or perhaps good morning or evening, depending upon your time zone. My name is Jim Dubinsky. I'm a professor of writing and rhetoric and part of the leadership team of the Veteran Studies Association. My colleague Bruce Pensick and I are your local hosts from the Veterans in Society Initiative at Virginia Tech. On behalf of the Veteran Studies Association, I want to thank Virginia Tech's College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences and the VT Center for the Humanities and Dr. Sylvester Johnson for sponsoring this event and providing the essential support in terms of infrastructure for us to host and publicize it, including my colleague Joe Fort, who is the general behind the scenes. I am at this point supposed to introduce our dean, Dr. Laura Belmonte. Is she here? I haven't seen her come in. But if not, I'm going to go ahead. She is a historian with a wide range of interests, including a book on U.S. propaganda in the Cold War that basically picks up where Waller ends, at the junction between war and peace. Like Waller, she turns a critical eye on U.S. policies, particularly those involving information. She came to Virginia Tech from Oklahoma State, a state I know well from my 3 extended stays at Fort Sill. Dr. Belmonte, if you are here, I'm going to turn it over to you. And if you're not, I'm just going to thank you for supporting us. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Jim Craig. There you are.
I am here. It wasn't letting me open my video, and it says I'm you. So I'm not quite sure what happened here, but I'll roll with it. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thanks so much to Jim and Bruce for all they've done to support veteran studies at VT. I'm really excited that we are working. We have a working group now under the college's new Academy of Transdisciplinary Studies that we are exploring creating a minor around veteran studies that I think is a perfect complement to our very successful War and Society program, but also something that I think is really necessary at one of the nation's 6 senior military colleges. So I really look forward to watching that develop in the forthcoming academic year, which will hopefully be quite a bit unlike the one we've just finished. So I wish you all a successful meeting, and I appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today and for the good wishes for this event, because I know it's been well planned. My colleagues have done a lot of work, and I'm going to turn it over to our co-chair and host of last year's COVID event, Jim Craig.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. Welcome to Conversations in Veteran Studies. My name is Jim Craig, and I'm on the executive board of the Veterans Studies Association. And I'm super excited to see the crowd we have here, and just it's been a long time coming. So I'm glad that we're here. Can you all see me? I'm looking at Jim. We're good? Okay. So before we get started, I want to identify the executive board of the Veteran Studies Association. Most of them you'll see will have this gray VSA background on their Zoom. They are and I don't see Mariana, but Mariana Grahowski, our fearless leader, Jim Dubinsky, Virginia Tech, Corrine Hinton, Texas A&M, Eric Hodges at Longwood University, Bruce Pensick, also Virginia Tech, Nancy Dallett at ASU, and myself at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. It's a small bunch, but we're really trying to make this thing work for all of you. So my institution, the University of Missouri, St. Louis, was slated to host the 5th Veterans in Society Conference back in March, on March 22nd of last year. That event was to be VSA's first foray out of the welcoming arms of Roanoke and Blacksburg. And it turned out it was going to be our largest gathering ever. We had over 150 registrants, and 41 papers or presentations were to be presented, and there were 4 national level guest speakers coming. And then COVID happened. And on March 10th, after all the rooms were booked and all the travel was scheduled and all the food was planned, we were forced to cancel that event. At the time, I wrote to the registrants, quote, "Time will tell whether we look back and see that we did the right thing or if we should have gone ahead with the conference." As painful as it was, I think we made the right decision for the safety of veteran studies scholars, for our respective campuses, for our neighborhoods and our communities. But I'm excited to get the ball rolling again. The Veteran Studies Association has put together what I hope will be an interesting and thought-provoking morning or afternoon or even evening of events for you. We'll start with a plenary session on Willard Waller's 1944 book, The Veteran Comes Back. Then we'll transition to a series of breakout sessions that will end, and then we'll end with a short conversation about where veteran studies is headed and how the Veteran Studies Association can support that forward movement. The VSA is a small, hardy, some may even call ragtag bunch of academics, advocates, and practitioners. And the support that comes from our various institutions is really critical to keeping things afloat. So I would be remiss if I didn't add another special thanks to the great folks at Virginia Tech. Jim Dubinsky named all of them. I don't even understand all of the different working parts at Virginia Tech that help us make this thing. Thank you very much for hosting and managing the technical aspects of the conference today. With that, we're going to move on to our first session, and I pass back to my distinguished colleague, Jim Dubinsky.
I'm getting ready to share my screen, and let's go here, share my screen, share a portion of my screen. Here we go. Okay, so this is where we're going to be. So this is, as Jim said, this is a panel on Willard Waller's book that he wrote and published during World War II.
Hey,
Willard
Jim,
Waller was born
Jim, your
in
screen is partially
1899,
covered.
just at the turn of the 20th century. And his father was a veteran of the Spanish-American War, and his grandfather was a surgeon on the Union side during the Civil War. He spent a short time in the Navy at the very end of World War I, pursued education and a teaching career that took him to Penn State and then Columbia University. He passed away unexpectedly in July 1945 at the age of 46. During his relatively short academic career, Waller explored a broad range of topics. Go here. And, you know, in these topics, which I've got some of the questions that he was asking here, he had three major interests. And each one of these interests, if you look up Willard Waller today, you'll still see him being cited, whether it's on the family, courtship and divorce, on education, or on the war and the veteran. And given that he lived through and served in the military during World War I and the pandemic, and experienced the meteoric rise of the stock market and then the Great Depression, followed shortly by World War I, it's no wonder that his work reflects an odd blend of realism and cynicism, tempered with a bit of hope. Waller believed in the American experiment, but he had seen it fall short over and over again. One of his books, The Sociology of Teaching, has had a long and broad influence in the field of education. He combined his passion for inquiry, social justice, and reform into his research on veterans and their many intersections with society through families, public policy, economics, education. When his book, The Veteran Comes Back, was published in 1944, it was widely reviewed. Here I highlight just three major reviews from a range of disciplines: psychiatry, political and social science, and history. These reviews demonstrate the breadth of influence Waller had and the breadth of perspectives he and others immediately associated with veterans, in which scholars saw the primary issues concerning veterans, especially given that the war was still, as of publication, neither over nor fully determined. As those of us on the panel and in our leadership team for the Veteran Studies Association have realized, Waller's book underlines and outlines what we would call a fundamental issue and question that influence the field that we are calling veteran studies, a field that emerges at least in part from what Waller called the science of veteranology. You may have noticed that our association's website goes by that moniker, and for good reason. Each panelist will speak for 8 to 10 minutes about one of the major sections in Waller's book and the impact of that section on today's field. Dr. Pensick will sum up the review and review the research questions and lead a Q&A. We can also take questions in the final section of the symposium after the breakouts. I now turn the session over to Dr. Eric Hodges, currently assistant professor at Longwood University in Virginia.
Thank you, Jim. Hello, everybody. I wish I could see you in person, but I guess this will have to do for now. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. Let's see. So is everybody seeing my slides here? Okay. All right. So as Jim mentioned, I'm going to be taking part one, which is titled "The Civilian is Made into a Soldier." So this looks at the process by which the civilian comes out of society and goes into the army or the military. And it also looks at the military experience itself, it's particularly wartime experience. So in the first part, there are 80 pages. So there's a lot of material there, more than I could summarize in the short amount of time that I have. But I picked out 4 themes that I hope will be interesting to scholars of veterans. So the first theme that I want to talk about is Waller mentions that this conversion from citizen to soldier is an irreversible change, right? He says on page 18, he says that a soldier can never quite be a civilian again, right? So the question becomes, why is it the case that this change is so significant and irreversible? To answer that question, Waller provides a metaphor. Right, he refers to the army, as he calls it, or the military, as the perfect social machine, meaning that it has a common purpose, right? In this case, the common purpose is violent action or winning wars. And it takes all of its component parts and puts them together to try to accomplish that particular goal. But in this case, those component parts are individuals who have been raised in society and have, are used to having personal responsibility, individual wills. And essentially, when they join the military, they have to transition their individual wills and individual liberty into what Rousseau might call the general will, right? So as you can imagine, this is a significant change and really reshapes the individual in a way that's hard to undo. How does this happen? He points to basic training, or OCS, the first 3 months where the civilian becomes a soldier. During that particular time, they're introduced to a new language, a new value structure, regimentation, et cetera. And also a key component of it is the fact that they are completely alienated from their former lives, right? So they don't have access to the same communications that they had before. They don't have access to their friends, right? They're not going to church, for example. So they're completely cut off from their civilian life and placed into this new world. All right, theme number 2 is the importance of solidarity or comradeship, as he calls it. Really, solidarity, if we're going to continue on with our metaphor, solidarity is the oil that keeps the machine running, right? And he says that it's so important that the soldier will sacrifice all for it, including their lives, right? And count the world well lost. So, and he says that solidarity is the one basic human need that civilian society has a hard time meeting that the military can actually supply. And according to him, the rationale for that is that in civilian life is marked by competition, right? And that competition prevents us from developing those bonds of solidarity. But there's also a flip side to solidarity. As powerful as it is while you're in the military, when you get out, it leaves a significant void, right? And that void can lead to all sorts of things. And I suppose, I have to raise the specter of January the 6th, right? And we can ask a question, was that void of solidarity a motivating factor that led, folks to join groups like the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, and things like that? And, I understand that this is a very, very small percentage of veterans, but it's something to consider. The third thing is that he talks about how the military reshapes the moral code, right? So, and he says that in civilian life, there are all sorts of controls that are put into place to ensure that people behave morally, right? So thinking about the long run, peer pressure, financial reasons. And when you join the military, a lot of those things are gone, right? So this notion of thinking about the long run is replaced with something he calls short-term hedonism, right? Where people are essentially seeking out pleasures. It's carpe diem, right? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. He also says that the military is characterized by a bitter, hard life. And in its play to address that, the military puts into place something called a cult of hardness, right? So in this cult of hardness is physical fitness, it's mental toughness, etc. And then finally, he says the primary virtue or value in the military, of course, is courage. Right now, once again, he says that there's also a flip side to this particular moral development of the soldier, is when they get out, oftentimes those values don't carry the same weight or may not even be important at all, so he claims. And then the final theme I want to mention is this notion of peace being a type of death to the soldier, right? So remember, the soldiers are brought together in this military machine to accomplish this particular goal. Once that goal is accomplished, the machine starts to fall apart, right? So solidarity goes by the wayside, discipline goes by the wayside, morale goes by the wayside. So this new world that the soldier has entered into is essentially falling apart, right? And he says that victory celebrations do not help the soldier when they come home after peace is achieved. Victory celebrations are largely put in place for civilians and not for soldiers, right? Because the soldiers are still in the army, right? They're still in the military mentality. They're still thinking about the fight. So some quick points of discussion regarding those particular themes. One, how does modern technology affect the alienation process? So as Jim mentioned, Waller was writing this book in the 40s, before the personal computer, before the internet, before social media, right? And you can envision during that particular time how effective this alienation process could be, how easy it was to cut somebody off from their former lives. However, I'm interested to know, does the internet, does social media, things like that, has that in some way affected the efficacy of this alienation process? Solidarity, right? I have several questions about solidarity. The first is war versus peace, right? So Waller focuses a lot of his work on the wartime experience, right? And he does mention that it's the case that the frontline veterans often tend to form the strongest bonds of solidarity. But is that question of solidarity, or is that experience of solidarity the same in peacetime as it is in wartime? And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, this solidarity, while it's wonderful while you're in the military, it creates a huge void when you get out, right? And he says that veterans, spend a lot of their lives trying to recapture that lost sense of solidarity, which could lead to positive things or could lead to negative things. And then the question that I had was, he makes the claim that courage, the type of courage that's displayed on the battlefield, may not necessarily be useful in civilian life. But is that really true? Right? I mean, obviously we can think of, various professions, police officers, firefighters, et cetera, where courage is important, but, courage is also important in our everyday lives as well, right? And this question of hardness, the cult of hardness, William James wrote an essay in the early 20th century called The Moral Equivalent of War, where the entire essay is devoted to praising these values. He calls it hardihood in the essay. So And then finally, and this is a question for those of us who are interested in helping veterans, how could we design a victory celebration that's, not just for the civilian, but for the soldier as well. Some future research questions. I'll go through these pretty quickly. I know I'm getting short on time. And this is actually pointing to a panel discussion or a breakout discussion that's coming up. How does serving the military affect a soldier's sense of patriotism? Obviously, on the face of it, it seems like it would be, it would raise the level of patriotism. But Waller also points out in the first part that once somebody joins the military, their primary focus is what happens within the Army, what happens in the military. It's not necessarily what's going on in society. So is their loyalty really dedicated to the country as a whole, or is it dedicated to those that they're serving in the military with? Does serving the military significantly affect the individual will? Remember, the first part is that you have to suppress the individual will to be a part of this collective, right? So I'm curious, how does that affect veterans when they get out, right? Does that mean that veterans, even when they get out, are not going to be as concerned with individual gain, perhaps, but are going to be more disposed to public issues, serving in a public office, volunteering in the community, et cetera? And then finally, how does the experience of solidarity affect veterans' life choices? Does it affect their careers? Does it affect their choice of family life? Does it affect what they do in their spare time? And I think that's it for me. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Nancy Dallett from ASU. He'll be talking about part 2. Nope, there goes my alarm. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Eric. I just want to give you a little warning that my connection was a little spotty there. So if I disappear, carry on without me. So Waller's 1944, The Veteran Comes Back, is really a core text for our field. And it serves as a sort of bookend with the simple 1944 characterization of veterinology as, quote, the veteran problem on one end. And on the other hand, a 2021 call for an increasingly multifocal, multidimensional, multidisciplinary field of veteran studies. And I want to thank Jim Dubinsky for running these slides for me. So how does Waller characterize the many veteran problems in his 100-page chapter 2, which he titles, When the Soldier Turned Veteran Comes Back to an Alien Homeland? So I want to begin by using his words, his alarming words, for his chapter and subchapter titles to describe veterans who he refers to as bitter with reason, with justification, and the bitterness is long lasting. He says the military skills are useless for peacetime living and that the soldier comes home angry. He talks about the many things that interfere with the veterans' adjustment. They had death too long for companions. He refers to every veteran as at least mildly shell-shocked and somewhat like a motherless child, and often dependent and sometimes criminal. When coming back to the economy, they need to start at the bottom. They feel that the country owes them a job. And his typology for veterans are disabled, psychoneurotic, pauperized, the lost generation. Also as immigrants in their native lands, and that politically the veteran is a Damoclean sword and they can become politically dangerous, and demagogues will try to make them into stormtroops. There was only a short caveat at the end of this typology where he says the majority readjust in time. So as one of our foundational texts, we need more understanding of its context within the framework of sociology. And of course, to understand how Waller was first and foremost a sociologist of education and teaching, and specifically his world as a World War I veteran whose ancestors served in the Civil War and wrote this book to be what he calls a fireball in the night, to, quote, wake up America now to the veteran problem before it descends upon us in all its fury. So what we do know is that in order to write this book and this, especially this chapter, Waller had to flatten all service to a rather unidimensional characterization, right as though everyone was in combat and saw the worst of humanity. He had to treat all branches of service as equally dangerous to the individual service member and afford little to no differentiation in this chapter due to rank, ethnicity, gender, mission, theater of war, etc. So while this flattening is completely off base in terms of our creating a theory of military-civilian relations and veteran culture, there are two overarching things we may want to take from this chapter that seem relevant to this moment, and one big push for veteran studies. So one is about the potential for veterans to become involved in white nationalism, as Eric mentioned, especially in light of the way the public perception is being shaped currently about veterans who are mobilized after military service and, quote, inevitably commit individual acts of violence or participate in collective insurrection, as Eric mentioned, around January 6th. So although Waller would have been surprised had he not died in 1945 to see that World War II veterans were actually embraced at homecoming and offered incredible opportunities for education and employment and home ownership and a shot at what was termed the middle-class American dream. After the Korean War, veterans were invisible or forgotten and then protested against after Vietnam. Now, after 9/11 voluntary service, they are being thanked profusely, seemingly to make up for the treatment of returning Vietnam War veterans. But still, there is a fear of the veteran as a time bomb who might not be prepared to handle the frustrations of reentry and adjustments to employment or family life or higher education. Waller's warning, while extremely hyperbolic, points to the dis-ease and distrust and distance civilian population still carries, and now with such a distance between military and civilian life experiences. And the other is his characterization of veterans having had death too long a companion and at least mildly shell-shocked. So he gives voice to what will become a major increase in our societal research and understanding of what we now refer to as traumatic brain injury, PTSD, and moral injury, that once were seen as the purview of only combat veterans and now serve as a conceptual and theoretical and therapeutic framework for trauma studies. After the Vietnam War, Jonathan Shea began listening to veterans and their language about their experience and lingering consequences of high stakes betrayals and the result of violation of their bedrock moral code, whether it was an action in which they participated and perpetrated, failed to prevent, or bore witness. And we now have more of an ability to distinguish the causes of PTSD as driven by fear, as opposed to moral injury driven by shame. His warning is now manifest in the unprecedented rate of veteran suicide in this country. So we have these two threads from Waller from this chapter, but both point to only dramatic psycho-emotional social consequences of service. And while both are essential to address, taking only warnings is a serious detriment to understanding veterans and non-veterans alike. So what is veteran studies poised to research and contribute beyond the mythically heroic or the helplessly broken, and to reflect the vast majority of veteran experience and culture? So we have the advantage of veteran studies come after a myriad of ethnic and area studies have long infiltrated academia. Let's look to academic studies in both women's history and African American studies programs, which both began with demands to complicate, nuance, and broaden traditional white his story, and now is on every campus and evident in all public life, exploded into extremely valuable change and research on issues of equality and justice, both revealing the different timeframes for gender and racial integration in different arenas, and have slowly peeled back the structural obstacles for home ownership, education, healthcare, equal pay, representation, and every other aspect of gender and race in society. In those cases, and also in the creation of Native American studies, Asian American and Pacific Islander studies, Latino American and Arab American studies, it was essentially a clamoring from within these groups to engage with essential questions previously not posed, and others, while not excluded, were not actively invited. Veteran studies has not yet had a far-ranging and deep demand for the field. We're building it, but I am pleased to say veterans are serving as the core subject experts on individual veteran experience and have an openness and willingness for civilians like me to engage in shaping the nature and breadth of the questions, and together we can create a robust new academic field that honors unique aspects of veteran culture, but also seeks to inform and integrate veterans within all ethnic and gender studies and reflect back on the wider societal structures and culture. So let's take Waller's warnings and turn his framing of the veteran problem and develop a robust new field of veteran studies in academia that also aims to communicate and engage with the general public, veteran and non-veteran alike. Let's have all the ethnic and area studies even more nuanced and informed and enriched by encouraging the inclusion of the veteran perspective, at least to begin with. Let's draw students, veteran and non-veterans, to enrich the schools of journalism, business, health sciences, philosophy, film studies. Open up for the next generation to pose questions like who gets to tell veteran stories, reflect them in memorials, movies, and all manner of cultural production. How do we account for the shifting demographics of entry into military service? What can we learn from the differences between conscriptive, mandatory to volunteer service in this country and globally? And so on and so forth. The avenues for research are endless. The Veteran Studies Association is here to support the formulation of the questions and the journal to support the research findings. Let's find ways to burst through the fears that galvanized Waller's second chapter and be in this together, to expand not just our understanding of the historic dimension of getting in and out of war, but the moral dimensions, and to promote individual and collective moral healing, not moral rewounding, to examine what is true homecoming, and to actively engage in the questions about our collective obligations to support those who serve. Finally, let's talk about the advisability and possibility for mandatory national service, be it military, AmeriCorps, Teach for America, Peace Corps, and what engenders the spirit of selfless and lifelong service. How rich our society could become if veterans and non-veterans had truly sturdy bridges and roads to meet across yet another of societal divides. But we can only walk across the divide if we walk across it together. Thank you. And I now pass it to Dr. Jim Dubinsky of Virginia Tech to talk about part 3.
Okay. Thank you, Nancy. In this part, this third part, Waller his focus shifts from veterans and soldiers to society and the many ways that the government and then veteran organizations, usually started by veterans with the best intentions, attempted to address the many issues outlined in parts 1 and 2. He focuses on the effectiveness or lack thereof of government intervention, usually in the form of pensions, but also health benefits, and the pluses and minuses of veteran organizations such as the Grand Army of the Republic and the American Legion. Waller sees these forms of intervention as critical because, as he said in his introduction, our policy is to pay on account of veterans too much, too late, to the wrong person, in the wrong matter. We have never spent enough at the right time or spent it on the right person to know how to turn a civilian into a soldier. Excuse me, we know how to turn a civilian into a soldier, but we do not know how to turn the soldier into a civilian again. This is the art we must perfect if we are ever to solve the problem of the veteran in our society. As you can see from the subtitles of this section, Waller remains blunt. My colleague Nancy began by talking about his focus on bitterness. He studied the history of veterans and what happened to them after each of the major wars and those in between. The bitterness comes from his perspective that the government and civil society have basically failed veterans. After the American Revolution, veterans, quote, went, starved, and were forgotten. The Civil War led to huge abuses of the pension system and the evolution of pension agents who took advantage of veterans, something that started after the Revolutionary War. He also focused on the intersection between the government and veterans organizations by outlining the excessive power that the GAR had in politics, power that led to what Waller called the 16 mule through the treasury, led in part by the commissioner of the pension, Corporal Tanner. As for World War I and its aftermath, he focused on speculators and spectacular failures and scandals. Given that the scandal of 1923 refers to the formation of the Veterans Administration and the horrific grift that he documents, his bitterness and pragmatic approach are justified. That his bitterness was only magnified later when the president and General MacArthur turned the forces of the military against veterans and their families in the Bonus March incident in 1932, just as the Great Depression was really taking hold. So in this section, Waller does a deep dive into the two primary forces he has seen that have been deployed to turn soldiers into civilians: pensions and military and veteran organizations. After witnessing what happened to the veterans he served with and watching those beginning to return home during World War II, he believed it was necessary to speak out and try to head off the significant challenges he saw or foresaw facing the country and its veterans when the Second World War ended and millions faced those challenges en masse. One of Waller's most significant points is this one: civilians do not understand the veteran. There are things about the soldier that only soldiers understand. This is a point I've often raised when talking about soldiers and their, military members and their families with civilians, and that makes the military and veterans a culture apart from the mainstream culture, which was documented in a reverse way in the beginning when Eric talked about how they transform these civilians into this other entity, and that other entity is hard to undo. The point becomes that the very essence of veteran studies is trying to find a way to reach that understanding together, as Nancy talked about. And that's why veterans organizations were needed. And one of the major reasons for these organizations is this very point: veterans helping veterans. However, that mission sometimes changes or morphs as the organizations grow and become more powerful. Waller recognized and documented that even organizations created with the best intentions sometimes fail or do not succeed in achieving their mission. He focused on three of the big four: the Society of the Cincinnati Grand Army of the Republic and the American Legion, and in the end, all fell short, although the American Legion fared the best among the three. Perhaps these essential questions are linked to what veterans organizations contribute to veterans and to society at large. And you might think that only Waller was noticing them. Waller stated that many persons regard the veterans organization as an unmitigated nuisance, a sort of thorn in the side of society. Part of the reason is the ways in which these organizations, particularly the GAR, VFW, and American Legion, politicize their work. Waller was not alone, and he was not just some old veteran with a grudge or a scholar who had some kind of spectacular insight. Many service members wondered about the value of these organizations during World War II. Bill Maudlin, in his book Back Home, published in 1945, after serving years in the European theater, had this cartoon very early in the book with the caption, 2 used car salesmen and 3 veterans organizations waiting for you to come out at a separation center. So the fact is that, you know, these organizations are not a panacea, and even veterans themselves were questioning them. So while Waller did not hesitate to criticize the organization, he also, however, saw another side. And that's, I think, the beauty of his work. And when you read the reviews, you see this duality that's mentioned by almost every critic and every reviewer. And in this case, Waller explained that these organizations perform many socially useful functions. He said, partially in response to the fears that Nancy raised and Eric highlighted, this is his quote, quite aside from any programs it may advocate, a national organization of veterans which ignores the cleavages of religion, class, politics, and nationality background performs a great service to national unity. One of the great evils of a post-war world is the persecution of minorities. If veterans join in this activity, the democratic process suffers greatly. But if veterans are organized, and we saw that, and Eric mentioned that with when you see 6 January. But if the veterans are organized in such a way to minimize these differences, if they mingle with members of other cultures, classes, and religious groups, things can improve. So when you're thinking about all of this, you know, there's a lot of research that it's just not something that we're starting or this, you know, we're bringing to the fore. It's been going on for a long time. And it did not begin with Waller, and it's not going to end with the VSA. But the body of work on these issues that Waller raised is large. And here I list 4 very different frames for this work. The first is from the year the war ended and the year Waller dies, 1945. Published in the Public Administration Review, its primary focus is on the GI Bill, or the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, which is interesting because that was Waller's main term. We have to have a readjustment of the soldier to civilian. So that's a term that it was very much in the public sphere then, and it continues to be. The author, a VA administrator, explains that, quote, the success of the program, however, depends not only upon the quality of its administration, but also upon the degree to which full employment in an expanding economy can be achieved. Like Waller, he acknowledges it won't be easy. He says there will be many reconversion problems, and these men will be out of touch with civilian life. We know what these problems are, he says, and claims that they did not know this at the end of the last war. I posit, looking back, we can now offer, and many already have, assessments of claims such as General Hines made. The next 2 pieces point to issues raised by Waller, focusing on what happens when veteran organizations gain power, or as Dr. James Martin presents, and I think he might be with us today, a deeply researched narrative about the man Waller claimed was heading the, quote, mule train that ran through the Treasury, Corporal Tanner. Finally, we're seeing pieces that are, this is really where sort of in Nancy's argument, we're seeing pieces shifting focus from the unilateral perspective of one gender, one type of veteran. We're beginning to look at veteran identities and how those identities impact the transitions. And I do think some of these people might be with us today as well. This was a piece published in the Journal of Veteran Studies just a few years ago. Currently, the congressional website for Veterans Administration lists 62 organizations, and the VA website lists over 100. I know they are important, both to veterans and the military. When I look back at my membership dates, almost all were 1977, the year I was commissioned. I recall my battery commander at Fort Sill and then my first unit commander were focusing on membership in such organizations as AUSA, USAA, AAF, MAA, and others. I've maintained these memberships to date, and while I can say they were not tremendous help as I transitioned out of the military when I retired, they did provide and continue to provide useful assistance, as have others. Prior to World War II, there were a few such organizations. These included the Jewish War Veterans of the USA, 1896, American Red Cross, 1908. After World War I, a few more formed, the American Legion, the Disabled American Veterans, the Italian American War Veterans of the United States, the Marine Corps League, the Military Order of the Purple Heart, and the Polish American Veterans of the USA. The boom periods, though, have been post-World War II and post-Vietnam. The fact that we've gone from basically 4 major ones to 62 And they're now categorized in 4 ways, sort of helps you see this. And it would be interesting to see the impact of all or some of these on veterans. The last slide is really the question, and I'm hitting, there we go. Relevant questions. Some of these I've listed here, and they're that how are legislative purposes and priorities of military and veteran service organizations changed in the past 77 years? Are military and veteran service organizations partisan or wielding power not in line with their larger mission? What is the history of student veteran organizations? What has been the impact of the growth of military and veteran service organizations that have increased focus on subgroups like mentioned gender and ethnicity? What differences exist in and among such groups internationally? And one of the things that's interesting, when you look internationally, you'll see that the US has over 100 and there aren't even 40 combined across the world other than the US. After all, these questions are built into larger questions related to democratic nations and notions of a welfare state. Who deserves the state's help and how should that assistance be delivered? We in VSA believe all these topics and many others deserve time and energy and are relevant to our modern world and the future of democracy. As I stated earlier, Waller's perspective was clearly colored by the time in which he served and lived. I now turn to my colleague, Jim Craig, fellow Army officer, now doing his work in the Academy.
Thanks, Jim. Let me see if I can get my screen up now. I think it's there. Is it there? Okay. So I was asked to cover part 4, which is helping veterans adjust to peacetime living. And I'm not going to cover all the parts as another one of those 100-page chapters. Here are the sections and the words he uses as he identifies the section. I do want to highlight that I think it's valuable for you. First of all, the book is free. Go get it. Digitally free, or if you want to go to Forgotten Books, they will actually publish one for you if you want a paper copy. And it is really one of the seminal works, and it's the basis of a lot of what we not just discussed today, but on other days. So Waller opens with a desire to establish context about veterans, which is interesting because in part 2, he really did flatten veteran service to a very specific type of male combat deployed type of veteran. What he does in the first chapter is he identifies again that veteran is a large blanket term, but they are individuals. And this is where some of the humanism of Waller comes out. He parses them by age. He parses them by education level. He parses them then by scholarly desire, like do they want to go back to college or go to college? He parses them, are they equipped to have and earn a living? And then at the end only does he parse them based on disability, both mental and physical disability, which is interesting, again, because in part 2, I think he assumes some sort of mental or emotional disability in almost all veterans. Then he moves on in the chapter to discuss what he identifies as the 5 goals of a veteran program. And he didn't talk about veteran services, he talked about a veteran program. Those goals were to restore the veteran to the position he would have occupied had he not served, and he uses he in all cases, to reinstate him into the communicative process of society, to encourage him to overcome his handicaps, to assist him to take a place in the political life of the community, and then to help him overcome his bitterness. A couple of points of conversation that I'd like to bring out with his words a little bit, and then I'll reflect on it in the next slide. First of all, he talks about all veteran programs and all veteran work must be done under what he called a flag of truce, non-political. The focus must be on the veteran and the veteran alone. See section 3, Jim Dubinsky's section, as he takes down some of the work of the Grand Army of the Republic and organizations like the American Legion as they became political and used veteran as a tool for other activities. He's very clear to say the focus of rehabilitation work for a veteran must be done in the local community. He doesn't believe it's a national level. It's a national level issue that must be solved at the local level. The work is done locally. Better than any rehabilitative program, education can work to overcome a veteran's attitude, helping him slowly overcome bitterness. That is a quote. I agree with that, but that's not for everybody. And it's interesting because earlier he talked about scholarly desire and education level and identified there's vets who just don't want to go back to college, and that's okay. And last, he talked about stop thinking about veterans' benefits and start conceiving of veterans' programs. So a couple of points of reflection that I found in reading this chapter. First, context matters. His parsing of what a veteran is, who a veteran is important. And as I bring that to today, I think context matters, especially when we think about our veterans. We have heard the bumper sticker 20, or even previous to that 22, in suicidality for veterans. It definitely helps raise awareness, but I'm not convinced it's helping to solve the problem. And it's because context matters. We know, if we dig into it, that 2/3 of those 20 are over 50 years old, half of them over 60. We know, if we dig into them, that most of them are not post 9/11 veterans. We know, if we're willing to dig into it, that most are white and most are male. We also know that most veteran suicides, actually most suicides, are accomplished with a handgun. And we know that only about 5 of those 20 have any connection to the Veteran Health Administration. So I leave this to further scholars, but the question is, are we building huge benefits without building a program? Are we spending enormous dollars and not focused in the right areas? Second, communities matter. A recent study by Sven Wilson and Whitker and Williams Rutger in Armed Forces and Society confirmed for me what might seem counterintuitive to others, and that is the likelihood of intensity of civic participation is higher among veterans and even higher among combat veterans than others in our society. Yet, veteran isolation is real, and the pandemic has probably exacerbated that problem. VA researchers have determined that loneliness by far was linked to depressive symptoms than more than any other form of social connectedness. It's loneliness, it's removal from the community that matters. Communities reaching out and providing opportunities to connect to veterans is critical to the integration of veterans today. The third, continued service matters. I refer back to this idea of civic engagement. And I ask, is there a difference between the veterans of the 1940s, the veterans of the early 1950s, and the veterans now? And I think the answer is yes. And it's not just in gender, and it's not just in the wide-ranging participation, it's in volunteer status. Consider the new breed, that's my term, of veteran service organizations. Organizations like Team Red, White, and Blue, Team Rubicon, Mission Continues, all are asset-based organizations. None spend their energy on benefit-centric activities. No longer are these organizations focused on what Waller called early in his prologue, lavish gestures of atonement to provide services and benefits to our veterans. It really reminded me of the 1946 letter written by General John Wainwright to discharging military members. I'm not sure if you can see that, so I'm going to bring this in a little closer. Wainwright wrote, and I'm going to start with the middle term, start being a leader as soon as you put on your civilian clothes. If you see intolerance and hate, speak out against them. Make your individual voices heard, not for selfish things, but for honor and decency among men and for the rights of people. No American can afford to be disinterested in any part of his country. I wonder, could it be possible that General Wainwright read Waller's book? I think that might be true. Final thought here. In addition to rereading the book and preparing for the event, I read several critiques of Waller's work and a few obituaries. Among the most interesting things I read was a piece of critique of Waller by Morris Janowitz. Janowitz is considered generally the patron saint of the current military sociology field. He wrote, and I quote, Waller had lost his scholarly autonomy, unquote, while at Columbia, and that his work reflected, quote, the defects of the institutionalization of the sociology enterprise. The implication being a humanist, the humanist perspective weakens a sociological presentation. I disagree. And in my disagreement, I make special mention of the way that Janowitz and other military scholars and military socialists of the era sociologists of the era presented their ideas to the highest bidder, which at the time was the US bureaucracy. To Janowitz, fielding a better army could be accomplished with better understanding of professions and appeal to market forces. At least for American society, that supposition appears to be true. But that's not where Waller was focused. Waller was focusing not on the fielding of an army. Instead, he was much more interested in the demobilization of every soldier. Enlistment was discussed, but discharge and what comes after service is much more important to Waller. It's true, Waller was not a fan of war. In his collection of essays, War in the 20th Century, he wrote, "The most unfortunate thing about war is that it accomplishes nothing. All the effort that goes into it is wasted." More than create effective and efficient warriors, I think Waller cared about the people and supporting them in their struggles. And in this trait, exactly the thing that some critique, I actually think makes Waller's work imperfect, that's true, but still valuable 77 years later. I now pass the baton to Dr. Pensick at Virginia Tech. Bruce, you're muted.
Someone had to do that. So by way of preface, like Nancy, I'm a full-time civilian. Worse, I used to be a political science professor, mea culpa. I want to be appreciative of time, which will be difficult. I want to encourage everyone in the audience, as people are already doing, to use the chat, not only during the presentations, and we'd like you to pay attention to your own breakouts, obviously, but also during the intervals. It doesn't look like we will have a lot of time for verbal face-to-face talk in the time we have here. If we're also to have time for a break, leave when you want, and in order for us to reconvene at 3:30. So Waller's Veterans comes back, certainly looks like it's a piece for its time and place. Yet I think we should read the book on veterans, just as we should his other war book, which is a volume or a symposium he edited called War in the 20th Century, in which he wrote a very interesting chapter called War and Social Institutions. I pasted the citations, including the online access to Veterans Comes Back and War in the 20th Century in the chat. I think we should read his books for how Waller suggests we approach the veteran civilian interplay in other times and places, to go beyond what he literally says, as you've already heard here. And again, as you've heard, Waller, the Veteran Comes Back, is a scholar activist. The book doesn't represent itself as an academic monograph. And I think we have to remember his audience is civilians. Many of us came into the idea of veteran studies by looking at veterans in society. And we have to remember there are two parts of this relationship, both of which have to be studied. It's not simply veterans as agents on their own, but also society as an environment, as a set of frames, as a collaborator or an obstacle, themes that Waller in fact represents. He overstates things. We know that. We know what his mission is. We understand that sometimes he may fire rhetorically for political effect. And he seems in pretty good politicking. As Jim Dubinsky pointed out, we see a lot of post-war US policies, veterans education, healthcare, veterans families are part of housing allowances. So even if the book didn't set a cultural tone, it certainly hummed it. Everybody's definitive movie about veterans reintegration, about World War II, the best years of our lives, could have been ghostwritten by him. Two aspects of Veteran Comes Back trouble me that I'm going to address here. Again, not so much for what Waller says, but how it, as an example of scholarship or thinking about veterans in society, how it constricts how societies and civilian scholars may think about veterans in their midst, and about how they think about themselves vis-a-vis their veterans. First, as Nancy Dowlett has noted, the effectiveness of the book's advocacy rests in part on demonizing veterans. It's easy to read Veteran Comes Back to slide from reading that veteran reintegration is the greatest social problem to thinking about veterans as the greatest social problem. In concluding the book, Waller does scholars no favor by likening his veteranology explicitly to criminology, the study of how social forces make some people bad, how well-designed institutions can make them better adjusted to the dominant culture, and how over the period that these dangerous victims of society are being rebuilt and reprogrammed, how they can be contained and controlled by benevolent but firm technocrats. Representing veterans as damaged, dangerous, yet also deserving the largesse of the public simultaneously calls for public action and raises questions of veterans' own agency that need to be taken seriously. Waller's representing the veteran as the product of these forces. Well, is that true, or in what respects, for whom, when, as several people have already remarked, both in this panel and in the chat? My second concern is that Waller's precedent is so American and so concerned with practical application over the immediate and short term. We might say that his war writings assume, again, both War in the 20th Century in 1940 and Veteran Comes Back in 1944, assumed, or at least recapitulated, essentially a colonial stance vis-a-vis the veterans and civilians of other countries and other periods. We're important, they're not, except insofar as we can appropriate pieces of their experience for our current purposes. Now, I don't deny that Waller's presentism and American focus can be useful then or now, but they are exclusionary. And that means blinders to both scholarship and to practical application. Waller's accounts of war and social institutions, that is, of how soldiers, hence veterans, are made and what they're made into, can suggest that social evolution necessarily led to the veteran as Waller represents him. The all-transforming war in Waller's account is total war, an all-consuming mobilization by dozens of countries of millions of civilians into formal military service, millions more into war production, and the co-optation, we might even say conscription, of tens of thousands of formally differentiated social institutions, schools, faiths, all manner of voluntary associations, and more to the cause of their side's victory. And it seems to me that Waller presupposes that wars by definition are fought only among nation states or among nations that aspire to be states. Now, scholars of international relations sometimes set conflicts like those within a so-called Westphalian state system that arose after the brutal wars of the conflict and death of the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. In that system, sovereign states exercised the monopoly on the legitimate use of force in their territories. Their civil and military organizations are hierarchical and rule-bound, that is, impersonal and bureaucratic. There's a law of nations, and there are the laws and articles of war. By the rules of this state system, there are people who deserve more than the thanks of a grateful nation, and there are bums with bad paper. Achilles has no place. Odysseus can take his oar and keep on walking away from Ithaca. Waller doesn't mention the Westphalian system, but I think he'd say that in some sense, at least, the institutions of the Westphalian order construct non-combatants, civil soldiers, and veterans in their lived experiences and identities as much, if not more so, than as they describe their laws, lawful duties, and entitlements. Now, with the version of the Westphalian system as his stage, Waller provides answers to some of the research questions that have underlain the Veterans in Society project here at Virginia Tech for nearly a decade. What does it mean to be a veteran? Who counts as a veteran? Well, how have people and institutions outside the Westphalian trope answered those questions in word or in their behavior? How adequate is our notion of veteran to account for that motley feudal band of brothers who fought and cried, God for Harry, England, and St. George? In what respects does veteran meaningfully apply to Geronimo or Sitting Bull, or to a former child soldier in Darfur? Rather than read people out of our inquiries the way Congress has done in much legislation until comparatively recently, veteran studies should explore new ways of representing a veterans society spectrum. Now, of course, given Waller's explicit focus on the total wars that defined the first half of the 20th century, we can't expect that he would address things like the veteran social interaction after the small wars that have punctuated American history well into our century, and not only involving Americans. Often these wars have been fought by small forces of professionals, veterans in the older sense of the term, as experienced soldiers and sailors. And those professionals working sometimes uncomfortably alongside odd lots of militia and volunteers. It's outside Waller's brief, but we can speculate as to veterans and their interactions with society following asymmetric or unconventional conflicts. This is an immediate concern of ours today, but also applies, and we need the historical scholarship to think about veterans, say, of the Indian Wars of American westward expansion. We can certainly speculate and then be scholars about how Waller's account, among others, could address veterans and societies of both or many sides of the Cold War. Now, I do expect that his assessment of the civilians during and after those non-total wars would remember what he says expressly about civilians of big wars. They are fickle, complacent, and self-interested. For a while, they may claim to support the troops, but they also outcompete the troops in the civilian game of life and turn the troops into others out of mind. But still, Waller is a point of departure for serious systematic interpretations of the veterans and their families within larger communities of full-time civilians. Just a couple ways these points of departure might be instantiated. In what respects was he right about the people he expressly described and analyzed at the time that he wrote? He was making an advocacy piece. As you've heard, he makes some big generalizations. Nancy's already given suggestions as to what could be addressed even about these male combat veterans in the US military. What would research show about those former GIs 20 or 25 years after the war, when America's TVs were filled with shows like Combat and 12 O'Clock High, Hogan's Heroes and McHale's Navy, and shows created by veterans such as The Twilight Zone and Star Trek that would eventually become cultural touchstones? What kind of evidence and theorizing should inform a production of the best years of our lives, the next generation? In the same context as Nancy suggested, what about Americans, starting simply with Americans at the margins of Waller's frame? He does nod toward women and Black people on the civilian side of the spectrum, but I think in his defense, we would say that by his own methodology, which rests on empathic understanding of his subjects to give heft to his case studies, There's simply some people that he cannot claim to understand adequately to represent. And that is perhaps a kind of integrity. And of course, how would Waller's questions and approaches reveal when applied in other frames, and what would they conceal? Second, and I'll close in this point, let's step back from the texts proper and look at Waller as an exemplar of the scholar and teacher about veterans in society. In this sense, he is his own corrective to the criticisms you've heard that were about his one book and his one chapter that addresses these topics. Waller draws on plural ways of understanding the world and oneself and communicating them to others. That is, he tells stories that at least partially illuminate complex and bewildering realities. Notice how much he juxtaposes literature. Conspicuously, Eric Maria remarks The Road Back, the book that no one reads of remark now, except veterans who've drawn it to my attention. Look at his prologue, 3.5 pages devoted to an exposition of the Old Testament story of Uriah, to drive home the thesis that civilians routinely betray, or at least disconnect themselves from veterans, and that it was ever thus. Like a good teacher, he tells stories that people can understand. He doesn't write for cloistered professional communities, at least not exclusively. Waller's kind of veteran studies thus serves both knowledge and practical action that can embrace veterans as citizens rather than as problems. They can encourage civilian understanding of veterans, not right after the total war, but with all the richness and diversity and the whole problematic notion of who is a veteran and what counts. Now, today's academic culture rarely rewards that kind of interdisciplinary scholar as much as they claim to, and especially at elite research universities. But collectively, we can and should bring those sorts of plural approaches in understanding and interpreting and expositing together and bring those and share them in fora like this and in the Journal of Veteran Studies and elsewhere. Now, I think all of us have probably talked at you far too long, and we are up against the break. I'm not going to come between you and your bladders, but let's see how much conversation we can start in this section for folks who do want to share screens. And certainly, again, we'll use the chat. We will keep the chats, and in some sense, we will try to make them available as part of the larger proceedings of which these videos and edited for typos versions of those videos will include the transcripts for those of you who prefer them or need them. And again, as a reminder, we will begin our breakout sessions at 3:30. But so we're diverging a little bit from the formal approach here, where there's us talking and there's your break. So let's see who has something to say. Please use the reactions button in your screen to raise your hand so that I can recognize you or someone else can call attention to you, and then we'll ask you to unmute and you can talk. So, Mayor, you had your hand up briefly.
No, I was clapping.
Oh.
I see David Vachi.
Okay, let's see if I can. Oops, I might have accidentally muted you again. There we go. Speak.
Hi there, everyone. I found the. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but your critique of Waller to be particularly insightful, and I would just offer a counterpoint, perhaps, to some of the earlier snippets that we got, I've not read Waller, but based on what has been described and what was introduced in the beginning, I would say that Waller should not be a foundational document that we should be using to guide ourselves today, except for in what we should not be doing. And that would appear to be to create monolithic descriptions of veterans that overgeneralize, and the very nature of talking about veterans as a problem. The return of veterans might be a problem, but veterans are not the problem. And we have got to stop this kind of deficit modeling in all of our approaches to veteran scholarship, or else we will never get out of these small gatherings where we all continue to talk to ourselves. So I just want to throw that out there.
Picking up on that point, and again, throwing things out here since I've made some odd for me popular cultural references. What sort of, and there will be a breakout session dealing with representation, so this can be continued there. What do you make about some of the representations, say in American Westerns, where a lot of the bad guys are Confederate veterans, and guys like Marshall Dillon and Paladin are not only Union veterans, they were former officers in the Union Army. Some of there have been one or two books written about noir films where, again, veterans play a very troublesome role. How would you, I'm not pitting you on the spot, David, but how do you think those would be, how would we frame approaches to those?
Hi there,
Is it-
can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, the unmute was disabled. I would say that, you can't change the past on those kinds of things, but I think that what it prompts is to, and someone earlier invoked the whole January 6th business, which irritates me to no end. It's nothing personal against whoever brought that up, but this idea that people are doing things in Westerns or in the real world or January 6th or any other time or place because they're veterans is ridiculous. These people were compromised before they entered the military. They were compromised while they were in the military, and they continue to be compromised. And the only thing the military may have done for some of these people is create an expertise with weapons that they might not have had before. But the military doesn't create bad and broken people. It only can make them worse if they're already bad or broken when they came in. But that's veteran bias from 20 years of service.
Travis.
Hello, thank you. I just kind of want to jump off a little bit about this conversation we're having right now. It seems to me that from what I've read, and I'm thinking back to like Leo Browdy from Chivalry to Terrorism, people like that veteran identity and just the commodification of it has been something that has been intrinsically linked to masculinity. And so when we talk about exclusionary rhetoric and who's a veteran and who's not, it's almost like it's the closer you come to combat, the closer you come to death or killing, the more veteran you are. And I don't know that this is something that is perpetuated as much by veterans themselves as it is civilians. If you look at the film examples that I haven't seen all the ones you've mentioned, but predominantly in our culture, veterans being this kind of returning figure who is dangerous, who has these skills, who has these sometimes means to solve social problems. It's always through violence. And I think the more we send that kind of notion to people after they're getting out, but also prior to getting in, it creates a stereotype that almost becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I agree with David that we need to get away from deficit models, both in, how we deal with veteran problems, but also in how we talk about veteran problems, because it becomes kind of this self recreating thing to where I posted that Charles Cooley quote earlier, where, you become the thing that you think other people think you are. So what are we doing to contribute to help veterans? But we got to be careful also not to contribute to hurting veterans as well.
Anyone else want to jump in? You guys, some of you deserve a real break. I don't want to hold you here, but anyone who wants to stick around certainly want to encourage. Okay, I see just going across my screen, Michael, Liam, and Julio. So Michael first. I hope I've unmuted you.
Yes, hi, Michael Smith here. Just on the topic you're talking about with stereotyping, that's something I'm looking at within my dissertation, focused on stereotyping and how it impacts veterans within career selection, not only the individual, but society. And so if individuals are being counseled by folks that may or may not have military service in their background, and tend to see those that have served as agents that can take action, but not necessarily have feeling. And again, these are generalizations, but essentially, yeah, if because it's such a small group right now that have served, and oftentimes society is very far removed, what is it that is causing those individuals to consider? Is it movies? Is it books? Is it stories they've heard from a family or friends? Those sorts of things. So yeah, essentially the ability to not only within a small community say who is and who isn't, but then to broaden the community to say, well, what does that really mean? And to get away from that, again, yes, to get away from just everyone that had put on a uniform, acts this way, talks this way, believes these things. There's a richness and diversity of folks that have served. So thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to try to get as many of the comments in while we wait for the 6 minutes till the next session. So Liam.
Hey, thanks for calling me. I just wanted to admire the turn of the conversation of noting that veteranality, all of these things are far larger than actual veteran communities, and that their role in society is not primarily administered, as it were, or fostered or grown by people connected to veterans. Veterans are such a very, very, very small percentage of the construction of the idea of veteran, the usefulness in public policy, public spaces, entertainment, literary history, my field. And so whilst we're having this conversation, I think I'm just encouraged to hear people sort of acknowledging the fact that although it might be nice to think of the work we do with veterans and describing an actual veteran community is like a rudder on a ship. The ship has many hands at the wheel, and far more influential hands than any associated with people who've had military service or people who've worked with people with military service. Consequently, much of our work needs to continue happening outside of a veteran studies environment because of the powerful ways in which the discourse of veteranality, as that term, I'm just going to use it. I hope it's not copyright. I don't have to pay a penny each time I use it. is really beyond the scope of any organization such as what we're contributing to. So thanks. It's exciting conversation. Appreciate being here.
Oh, thank you. So, Julio. If you're still there. Okay, well, Sean is there.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, everyone. It's really, I don't know how many on here are veterans, but I'm a veteran myself, 21 years, a combat veteran, Iraqi War 06-07. I love to hear the intelligence across this Zoom room. It makes me so happy. I currently serve as a senior military advocate at the Pat Tillman Veteran Center at ASU, and I spend my time helping student veterans transitioning out of the military and into higher education. And I have just this one thought. I understand that we are viewed in a certain way. However, I also know that in the military, they set a very good groundwork into making you moldable. And so if you spend 21 years in it, you can become hyper patriotic. You can become very nationalistic. You can have those things because they're set as your foundation for good purposes. We have to survive war, and we have to be on the right side in the midst of it. Otherwise, it's hard to go out and put your life on the line. So when we say all of these things, I also realize this fact that I see a lot of student veterans coming in, and they believe what their ASVAB told them they could be. There's 3 things that the Department of Defense said you were good at when you took your ASVAB. And when they come to college, guess what they think? They think what the Army told them. And they don't even sometimes know how to dream bigger and broader than the 3 things they were told to do. So we are conformed in the culture of the military. And so we can't disregard that fact, I think, when we have this larger discussion about what do veterans do in our society. We are conformed in such a way that we react that way. I mean, that's what I think anyway. So thanks for the time, and I appreciate everybody.
Okay, now speaking of time, we're 3:29 and we're supposed to start the next sessions at 3:30. Let's sort of aim that way. I think a lot of these conversations can take place in the breakout room. I'm going to ask Joe to start putting up the slides to help people find their way to the breakout room if they have not pre-registered for a particular one. And again, I think we'll have a lot of useful conversations in those contexts as well as in our subsequent plenary.